Today's video was sponsored by Pop Culture Zone Pressing Services. If you need your comic books pressed, I personally vouch for Pop Culture Zone as being one of the best professional companies in the game, offering hands down the lowest prices out there. Services start at only $9.99, and every order placed will receive free fast track turnaround times. Even though I press comics for my personal collection, whenever I need a professional press for my key comics, I send them off to Pop Culture Zone, and every single book that I've received back, every single one, has had results that have exceeded my expectations, and I am sure that they will exceed your expectations as well. Make sure you go check the link in the description below to head over to their website, popculturezone.com, for complete details on services and how to begin your order.
What is going on, everyone? Chris with Journals, Comics, and Pop Culture. Today, we're going to be asking a what-if question. What if speculators didn't exist? This is going to be a fun topic of discussion today, folks. If you aren't subscribed to the channel, please take some time to do so. Check out all the awesome links below, folks. Let's talk about this. What if comic book speculators and speculation didn't exist? This is going to be such a hot topic, and I'm going to approach this from two different ways. One is historically, and two, kind of fitting to where we are at right now. So let's talk about historically. What does speculation mean historically to comic books? Well, some people might say that speculation didn't exist until the 90s, or it's a newer thing. That's not true. Comic book speculation really started booming towards the late 60s, early 70s. This was a transitional period during that early, during the Silver Age, which is often called the Marvel Age because of what Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Ditko, and all those creators did with introducing the Silver Age Marvel Legacy characters and what it meant to that generation growing up. Hitting into the late 60s, you had a transitional period where these stories and these comic books went from books that were, read, folded up, and put in your back pocket, or, just ripped to shreds because you're reading it, you pass it off to your friend to read it, and then, it gets worn down, and your parents end up throwing it in the garbage after a while, sort of like a standard magazine, right? Up in the late 60s, people started finally realizing, hey, there is something here with these books. I'm going to hold on to them because I think they're going to have value. It was around this time that the first Overstreet Guide came into existence, and you started really seeing a market for back issue comics being priced at, a bit higher than cover price. So in those days, if you had a 12-cent cover price comic, you might see a back issue sell for 20 cents or a quarter. So going into the 70s, this really peaked. And it was around the early to mid 70s where there was a lot of rhetoric that was going on that is very similar to the rhetoric of today. And what is that? This is a bubble. This comic collecting for, speculating on as an investment, it's going to pop. It's not going to hold. It's for the birds. It's not going to last. Well, leading in deeper into the 70s, this country specifically was hit with multiple, recessions that really affected inflation. And that's why you see comic book prices increase so much in the 70s. You went from 10 cents to 15 cents within a period of about a decade in the 60s. You went from 15 cents to, I believe, did they come out of the 70s at 60 cents? Or was that early 80s, around 81 when it became 60? I don't know off the top of my head, but that is a huge increase, all right? Even in the 80s, you saw a bit more inflation, but that's just a sign of the times after that, even up until today. But the point that I'm trying to make is that comic books and comic books as a collectible survived the 70s during this time of such extreme inflation. All right, don't quote me on this, but I think the closest extreme inflation that we've seen comparative to the 70s has been probably the last 15 years or so. So that speaks a lot of volumes to what comic books meant. Now, what does that mean to speculation? Well, it means speculation at essence means we're looking at these books, we are speculating on these books, assuming that they are going to gain value over time. The speculation is what created the demand on the secondary market, and which is what ultimately led your comic books and your parents' comic books and your grandparents' comic books and all those comic books from those eras to have value. All because of speculation. So if it wasn't for speculation back in the early days, comic books as we know it would not exist. Not only did the speculation impact what the back issues sold for on the secondary market, but it kept the primary market thriving because it was the interest of the historical legacy of all these characters that allowed new and fresh takes to continue to happen in going into the late 70s and into the 80s. And it's what allowed the 80s to be so revolutionary in storytelling and art form, etc. This is what allowed creators like Todd McFarlane to come into the game, Frank Miller to come into the game and do what they did, because there was a healthy balance, a very healthy balance of knowing that comic books were a collectible, but also understanding the deeper intrinsic value of what the superhero was, especially with Stan Lee and Marvel Comics leading the way and really grounding the superhero. And you could kind of see DC following that trend, going different paths in the 70s with reinventing the Joker, even going into the 80s with bringing Frank Miller on to write Batman and so forth. You took that different gritty tone and grounded it, right? So now we're in the 80s and you have this very healthy balance of comic book characters, the art and the storytelling appealing to younger kids, older kids, and now at that point in time, really adults, that started collecting in the 50s and 60s during the Silver Age. And this obviously led into the 90s. And we're not going to talk too much about the 90s and all that, but a lot of people get it mistaken saying that, the crash of the 90s, comic books completely died out. That's not the case. I'm going to briefly reiterate the key points of the 90s. Speculation didn't ruin comic books in the 90s. All right. It's how the publishers reacted to speculation. Because if the publishers reacted to speculation differently, it would have continued to be healthy for the industry. An example is this. Going into the late 80s and the early 90s, when you got the first appearance of Venom come in, and then you get into the 90s and you have these characters like Deadpool and Gambit, and that led into the creation of Image with Todd McFarlane, those creators going over there, and the reboot of X-Men with Jim Lee, and you have millions and millions of copies of these books printed. If the publishers understood, look, I know that the industry's booming right now. We got young readers, we got old collectors, we got a speculator market that's really booming right now, and they're really saying we're getting into comics because they're going to be worth money. If they never printed comic books in the millions, comic books as we know today would have been completely different, because the 90s would have never happened. The 90s as we know it would have never happened. By just that alone, now, I can't sit here and I don't have a magic ball. I can't tell you what would have happened. But if they didn't mass produce comics, we never would have saw the crash like we did. And remember this, the crash only pertained to new books. Back issue books, if you guys go and do your research, back issue books, especially key books, continue to increase in value during the 90s crash. All right? It's a fact. You can go out there and research it. That meant the demand was still there for that on that secondary market. But it hurt comic books as an entire industry so much because Remember, publishers don't make money off of the secondary market. They only make money off of primary market. And when your new books that are hitting the shelves every week that you're mass producing aren't selling now, that's why companies like Marvel were going into bankruptcy, had to sell off the rights to all their characters, and so forth. So, going into the 2000s, obviously, at the heart of comic books, it's about the art. And the art means the writing as well. Writing is art. It's about the storytelling and the art and the intrinsic properties of what comic books means. Comic books mean to everyone and to anyone that loves them. So you had an independent boom in the 2000s with, Image and how they reinvented themselves. Obviously, The Walking Dead speaks for itself, and then you had Marvel really kind of, again, take a different tone and approach to comic books. And that really brought people back in to the love of the storytelling and the art and everything about comic books that's intrinsic to them. But the speculators at heart never left or never wanted to leave, because most of us that speculate have some type of love for the hobby. So it is at this pivotal point in time that you had a bridges gapping different generations once again in the 2000s, getting back into the hobby, because you had a lot of people that were my age or even older, that are now probably going in their 50s or 60s, that pulled out of comic books in the 90s, right? Now they're getting back into it. And while they're getting back into it, you're seeing an evolving speculative market. And what does that market consist of? It consists of different ways that we can evaluate and value comic books. One of those things, CGC and the graded comic book. This is just another way that we can add an investment value onto comic books, right? So this leads up into modern day and where we're at right now. And we have to ask ourselves that question again: what if the speculator didn't exist? I'm going to reiterate. We just went through all the history. If the speculator didn't exist, all of your comic books would be worthless. Your Hulk 181s would be worthless. Your Amazing Spider-Man 129s would be worthless. All of those blue chip keys, even your Action Comics #1s. Now, I don't want to say that they would be completely worthless. We can debate that in technicalities of the defining words that we're using here to speak on these things. But the bottom line is, if the speculator didn't exist, we wouldn't have comic books the way they are today. Speculators right now, though, it is a different beast, and speculation is a different beast. I would say it's hyper-vigilant. I would say that it's very extreme. A lot of people say the 90s were extreme, because the way that the publishers reacted to the speculative market, with the foil covers and kind of this extreme characters and this extreme art. Well, the extreme that I talk about in modern days, right now, currently, is not necessarily what's going on in the comic book. We have an extreme nature of reacting. We have a very extreme nature to react in a way that is very, very hyper-vigilant. I've said this before a lot, and I talk about it a lot. Having instant access, whether it's on a computer or on a smartphone, on the internet, we have apps, we have databases, we have YouTube, we have everybody talking about this stuff, and we can get information like that. Even the way that we manage money and how we consume things. Now remember, I remember being a kid, even in the 80s, not everybody had I think debit cards started, and again, for somebody that's maybe a bit older than me, let me know in the comments, when did debit cards come about? Because what I remember is you had a bank card, you had your ATM card, you had credit cards, but you had an ATM card. And before you go grocery shopping, I remember doing this, going grocery shopping with my mom. My mom would have to go to the bank, or they'd write a check, right? You either go to the bank and you go to the ATM and you get cash out and you use cash to purchase things, or you write a check. So it was much different back then of how we even spent money. Now we could be in a virtual store. We could be in a virtual store. We could be on our couch, in our living room. We could be sitting in a car as a passenger in a car. We could be at school. We could be at work on a break. And we could virtually put ourselves into a store. And with the click of a button, buy something right there, because we have PayPal, or we have all these, we have bank accounts that are attached to all these online stores or whatnot. We not only get information instantaneously, but we can purchase things instantaneously. So what does that do to the speculative market and to us that are speculating on comic books? It makes us more reactionary. That's why, even more so than ever, the comic book market, in terms of its fair market value, in terms of its value index, is so volatile, because it could take one or two people that are extremely reactionary, wanting to get their hands on a book just like that, and they got money to spend, or maybe they don't, but they're doing it anyways, and all they need to do is click a button. It creates this extreme environment. And if we didn't have the speculator today, the extreme of that still is that our comic books would be completely worthless. So to answer the question, I wouldn't ever want a comic book hobby, not having the speculator. And remember, I say this all the time too, most of us have a little bit of different pieces of what it means to be a collector. Most of us have a little bit of speculator in us, because some of us care about the value of our comic books. I know as kids in the 80s and in early 90s, we were speculating on the next hot thing. It just wasn't as extreme as it is now, because we didn't have the tools back then. I remember when the Todd McFarlane Spider-Man #1 came out, and I saved up like 3 weeks of allowance to go buy it from my comic book store. You know, it was the first big book that I bought that was like more than cover price. I think it was $10, but still. So it's nothing new, but it's just how we handle ourselves. So, you know, when people look at the speculator or the speculative market as this huge negative thing, they look at this extreme negative thing, and they forget that at its core, speculation is very, very important to this hobby. And it's very much a key pillar of the foundation of this hobby. But it's all about how we go about it. We have to keep ourselves in check. All right. We have the power to dictate the market, so to say. And I use Starbucks as an example, and I know this may be an extreme. Starbucks, I used to work at Starbucks. 20 years ago, when I was working at Starbucks, a small latte, a tall latte, which is their small size, was $2.30. Now, I believe it's somewhere around $4.50. So, it's almost doubled in value, in cost, excuse me. Why are they allowed to double the cost over the last 20 years? Well, one, overhead. Supplies cost more. Inflation, that's a real thing, right? But also supply and demand. As long as you're going and standing in line at Starbucks, or going through the drive-thru in Starbucks, getting your tall latte or grande, vanilla cappuccino, whatever it is, pumpkin spice lattes, as long as you're going there every day, spending that money, they're going to keep charging what they charge. But if we took one day nobody went to Starbucks and said, you know what, I'm not going to pay that much for a coffee today, it would force them to lower their price. That's an example to the fact that when we get FOMO. And we get this fear of missing out on a book because we're speculating on it or because other people are speculating on it. Stop looking at the outlier. I've been saying this a lot lately. We don't need to follow the herd. Are you a follower or are you a leader? Just because there's a $5 book and 1 or 2 or 3 people see an announcement or see an end credit scene or read a blog website of somebody giving a, very non-valid, non-credible statement of some type of movie is going to be confirmed, and that $5 book is now selling for $80 in a matter of hours. We can either follow suit and we can pay what they paid, and then that value is going to be a set fair market value because, hey, when we see them up for sale, now the sellers are pricing it at that price and they're seeing if we'll bite. Or we can sit back and say, those few people that paid $80 for that book, they're tripping. I don't need that book right now. I don't even know if this movie is confirmed. I don't even know. I don't even like the book that much. I'm not paying that much. And then what's going to happen is the supply is going to sit because the demand is going to minimize and they're going to be forced to lower their price. We have the power with our collective conscious to drive, our collective consciousness matters. Absolutely. We need to be on the same level in terms of being non-reactionary, being proactive, being patient, and being smart with our purchasing power. All right. So when you talk about, dirty flippers and speculators that are just hoarding up dollar books and then flipping them for $10, $20, $30, $40, $50, well, guess what? There's a line of ethics, right? There is. But you know what else there is? There's the power that you give them. We give them the power. We don't need to watch a YouTuber and if they're saying, buy this comic book now. We don't need to buy it now. We don't need to listen to them. Just because a book's hot and somebody else buys it for a certain price doesn't mean you need to. We need to regulate and check ourselves, guys. So when it comes to what if speculators didn't exist, it wouldn't be good. Do I feel that the speculative market is teetering right now on a fine line? I do. But at the end of the day, we all have to play our part. And pointing fingers at somebody else isn't going to do anybody justice. Don't be mad at a YouTuber because they're talking about a book selling for $80 that was for $5 a day ago. As long as they're doing it ethically and they're just reporting it as news. Don't be mad at an eBay seller trying to sell that book for $80 if somebody's willing to bite and buy it for $80. They're making a statement saying, well, this is a fair price. This is a fair market value. Don't get mad at them. All you can do is be in control of yourself. You can educate the circle around you, and you could be a voice in the community, and we can be a community to communicate with each other and interact with each other to where we're holding each other accountable, and we're being smart collectors. We're being educated collectors. And at the end of the day, we're all still enjoying the hobby that we love. So with that being said, folks, I hope you took something away out of this. Again, don't hate the speculator. Don't hate the speculative market. It's absolutely needed. It is needed. Otherwise, we are not going to care that our comic books are absolutely worthless when we wake up tomorrow. Or even, because I've said this before, the speculative market, even though it benefits more the secondary market, it does add health to the primary market, which essentially helps out the publishers, which allows for back issues to thrive, and it allows for new comic books to continue to be created, which then allows these new movies and TV shows to be created. And it's all this, woven web of everything playing its part for the positive. So be smart, be proactive. And at the end of the day, that's all we can do. Keep enjoying the hobby, folks. Thank you guys for watching. Let me know your thoughts and what you thought of the video down below. Be well, and until next time.